The next picture is the story of the big epic story, which is the archetypal story that leads to everything we have to do about Eucharist. But there is a story of Moses, right? So Moses, he's taking a walk in the desert, and what does he see? This burning bush, right? And he's like, whoa, this is interesting, because why? The bush is burning, but it's not like being consumed. There's fire, but the bush is still there. So he's like, well, this is interesting. He gets closer, and then he hears his voice, Moses, remove your sandals, for you are on holy ground. And so Moses removes his sandal, he approaches, and he meets God. And God has this dialogue with him, and what does God ask him to do? Go and free his people who are in bondage, in slavery in Egypt, right? Under Pharaoh. And Moses is like, me? You want me to do this? Oh, no, I don't want to do it. And God says, go do it. Okay, so then he goes to Pharaoh, right? And he says, my God says, set my people free, the Israelites. And Pharaoh says what? No. And so what begins? The 10 plagues. The 10 plagues. This is a very important story because it's the archetype of everything that we're going to understand as Christians today. But then we have the 10 plagues. There's waters, frogs, gnats, swarm of flies, and all of these things keep inflicting the Egyptians. And final one, the 10th plague is the firstborn dies. Now, the firstborn dying is horrible, right? Now, so the angel of death is going to fly through Egypt, and he's going to slaughter the firstborn in every household. Unless there is what? Unless the angel sees what? The blood of the lamb painted above the doorposts. And so here we will see, and we're going to go over the scripture passage later, but here we see the first Passover prescription, the prescription for the Passover. The Passover is the highest of all the Jewish feast days. The Passover is a big deal. So God, or Jesus, builds the Eucharist upon the biggest deal that our Jewish ancestors had, which is the Passover. And so what was this? They had to take a male, unblemished, year-old lamb. They had to slaughter it. Then they had to eat its flesh with bitter herbs. Interesting. They had to eat it with bitter herbs and with unleavened bread. Think about those ingredients, right? The lamb, bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and there's also wine, right? And so this becomes then the Passover ritual. It's a Seder meal that the Jewish people would partake in once a year. So the angel of death flies through, sees the blood of the lamb, and he passes over. By the way, that's where the word comes from, right? The angel of death passes over those houses that had the blood of the lamb. So that's where the word Passover comes from. So later on, you see at the Last Supper, what was the Last Supper? The Passover meal that Jesus prescribes. That Jesus tells disciples to do. But in any case, so Pharaoh has 10 plagues and he says, this is a headache. Fine, you can get out of here. And he lets the people go. So there we see that whole story of the Israelites running away, Moses leading them, and they get to this big Red Sea. And then Pharaoh changes his mind. He says, wait a second, what am I thinking? I like having these slaves doing all this hard work for me. So he sends his soldiers to go after the slaves and recapture them and bring them back. And so the Israelites are in front of this huge body of water. And then they look behind them and they see the whole army of the Egyptians coming at them. And they go to Moses and they say, Moses, what in the world are you doing? You lead us out here to just die. And Moses is like, I don't know. So he goes to God and he goes, God, what are you doing to me? You told me to let my people go, so I did. Now what do you want me to do? And then God says, put the staff in the water. Boom, and what happens? The Red Sea parts, right? And then the Israelites cross through the Red Sea. And then Moses puts the staff back into the sea. And then it closes in upon the Egyptian soldiers and they all die. And so this begins then 40 years of traveling through the wilderness for the Israelites. 40 years. Imagine that. Okay? During those 40 years, what happens? They're in the middle of nowhere, so God has to feed them. What does he feed them with? Manna. That's that white bready substance that they wake up in the morning, they come out of their tents, and they see all this manna on the ground. And they collect it all up, and that becomes their primary food throughout their time in the wilderness. Now later, the Israelites get really tired of this manna, so they come to Moses and they complain. And so Moses goes to God and says, my people don't like this manna. So God says, all right, fine. And he sends them quail. So they get to eat some quail meat as well later. But this manna becomes so significant. I mean, you got to bookmark this clearly in your head as a very significant gift from God. This bread, literally they believe that came from heaven. Well, while they're wandering around in the wilderness, they're supposed to worship the one God, and they're supposed to, persevere and help each other out, blah, 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 but they don't. Why? Because they're humans, right? And so, while Moses is up on the mountain having this intimate mystical dialogue with God, the people down on the ground level are starting to do idol worship, right? And so they get gold necklaces and rings and everything. They combine all that together and they create this golden calf, right? Moses comes down from the mountain carrying the 10 Commandments, right? This, again, from heaven. He gets this, right? It says that his face was gleaming white. Dazzling, like he was dazzling, his face was gleaming with light as he came down this mountain. But as he comes down, he sees this horrible scene of idol worship going on among his people. And he is, what? And so he gets the 10 Commandments and he shatters it, right? I don't know, that was kind of temper. I wouldn't have done that to the 10 Commandments, but he was so upset. And then he goes on this long story, he tells them to grind up all of that and he puts it into the water and makes everybody drink it and all that kind of stuff to grind up the idol. And then somehow they get the 10 Commandments back or something. But the whole point is the manna and the 10 Commandments were seen as direct interventions. The Jewish people saw this, the Israelites saw it as a direct intervention of God from heaven. It is him entering into human history and giving sustenance and giving the law. Now think about this, all right? They wake up and they see this. So this is truly bread from heaven from them. They think this is a real gift from God. And the 10 Commandments, same thing, right? So what do they do then? Because they see this as such a treasured gift, this manna and the 10 Commandments, they put it into what is now known as the Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant. And so you see that in that center picture there. They contain these two gifts from God, the manna and the 10 Commandments in that Ark of the Covenant. Well, later, so this Ark of the Covenant becomes for the Israelites the central rallying point for them. It is the most sacred of all the things that they have, because it really is containing the direct presence of God, the God who came down to intervene for them. And so they want to now carry this everywhere they go. So now they're wandering through the wilderness with the Ark of the Covenant. There's a priestly class now that has been activated to be the guardians of this Ark, and they have soldiers to guard it as well. And they go town to town or city to city, conquering, and this Ark of the Covenant is with them. And one of the stories is when they finally arrive at the Promised Land. After 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, they arrive at the Promised Land. And the first city of the Promised Land was Jericho, right? And Jericho had these huge walls around it. And then there's a long story of Gideon coming with his soldiers, and then all the walls came crumbling down. And then they are to cross into Jericho. Now, how do they cross into Jericho? Well, they take this Ark of the Covenant, and the priests, as soon as the high priest's foot or the priest touches the Jordan River, the river stops flowing. So then all the Israelites can cross in to Jericho, where they conquer and they begin their life living in the land of milk and honey. And so Solomon, later, it was King Saul at first, and then Saul was kind of a bozo, and then King David came along, and King David wants to build this temple, right? He's sitting here in his palace. They made him a palace of cedar wood. He's sitting in the palace, and he goes, wow, this is a nice palace. And then he says, but wait a second, my Lord is sitting in a tent outside. This is the Ark of the Covenant, and they just had a portable tent for the Ark of the Covenant. And there's something wrong here. I'm sitting here in a house made of cedar, and my Lord is out there in a tent. This ain't good. And so he starts to have a vision of creating the temple. And so he starts getting plans together. He starts doing some of the fundraising and everything to get this temple built. But what happens? God punishes David. And he says, David, you are not allowed to build the temple. Because why? Because know why? He had a girl that he was lusting after. But the problem was this girl was married. So what is David going to do? He's going to send that husband to the front lines of battle so that husband dies in battle. And then she's all his. And then God sees that and says, for that crime, you will not build my temple, right? You did a good job leading my people, blah, 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 but you will not have the privilege to build my temple. That'll go to your son. So Solomon comes along and he builds this temple. And that temple diagram is here. I wish I had more space. I wanted to make it bigger, but it's a very, 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 very detailed construction. It's in the Bible, the details of how this temple is to be constructed. But within the temple, the two primary things I'd like to draw your attention to is the Holy of Holies. And that is hard to show you here, sorry, but it's this section of the temple, towards the left, that section that it's supposed to be covered by a curtain. And inside there is where they placed the Ark of the Covenant, right? That's the Ark of the Covenant that they had been wandering around with. They placed that in the Holy of Holies. That place is now considered so sacred that nobody would dare enter into the Holy of Holies because they believed it was the true presence of God. And they were not worthy. Nobody was worthy. Only the high priest would go there on Yom Kippur to light incense, and he would dare enter into that. That was only once a year. So this Holy of Holies, this whole idea of God truly present, that is not first a Catholic thing. It's not a Christian thing. It came from our Jewish brothers and sisters who believed in the true presence of God in the Holy of Holies. And that the whole temple was meant to glorify, to magnify that presence of God, right? And so we see also then outside is the altar. And this is where they have the altar of sacrifice. The altar of sacrifice is on the outside there. They also have water for washing. They have candles. I mean, think about all of the elements of the temple and then all the elements we have in a Catholic church. The whole point of our Catholic faith, what I'd like for you to, one of the things to draw from is continuity, right? We are not meant to be so radically divorced from our ancestors that we're so on our own with no visible and theological and spiritual continuity with our past. So we carried a lot over from them. You know, like the skull cap that the Pope and the bishops wear comes from our Jewish brothers and sisters. The whole water, the holy water fonts, that comes from our Jewish brothers and sisters. Candles, incense, vestments, the altar, all of these comes from our Jewish brothers and sisters. Continuity between the Old Testament leading into the New Testament, right? So here we see then the temple that houses the Ark of the Covenant. And you see at the very, very bottom right side, that temple still exists to this day. All right? But why do they call it a Wailing Wall? You know, that Western Wall, you might see that popes and presidents always go there and touch that wall, right? And the Jews are all at that wall and they're praying. But they used to call that a kind of a Wailing Wall because their temple was destroyed. Right? And that temple was the true kind of the crux of their national identity. It was a unifying point. It was a remembrance of the high glory days under King David and King Solomon. It was a huge deal for them. And so when it was ravaged by the Romans and later by Muslims, it was like gut-wrenching. It ripped their hearts out, right? And so there's still a mourning that they still do at that wall, which is the piece of that Temple of Solomon to this day. Right? And you see that big huge dome there, right? That was when our Muslims invaded and they just took that temple and built their mosque right on top of it, right? And so that right there is, the dome is at, I always thought, to be honest with you, before I went to Israel, I thought that, I didn't know that was in the temple, and I always thought it was a Catholic church, and I didn't realize that there was a crescent moon on top and all that, so I was a little oblivious to the whole thing. So it wasn't until I went there that I learned.